Thank you very much, Anne. So what I'll be talking about tonight is a manuscript on the traditions and antiquities of the Barony of Iverk, which was written back in 1850, 1851, and has never been seen much since. So you're getting a scoop tonight. It's the first public lecture about this manuscript. So just to put you in the picture, the Barony of Iverk is in the southwest corner, more or less here, of County Kilkenny, between Carrick-on-Shore and Waterford here, with places like Piltown, Fidown, Kilmacow, Mooncoin within it. The man who wrote this manuscript lived in Tibbroughney, which is just there beside Piltown, really. So I'll move on to the next one. The origin of the manuscript goes back to the early days of the old Kilkenny Archaeological Society, way back around 1850, 51, 52. And two of the great stalwarts of the Kilkenny Archaeological Society and founder members and honorary secretaries for the rest of their lives were the Reverend James Graves, you see here on the left, and John G.A. Prim. Now they had a little fund to pay people to write accounts of their local antiquities or traditions or songs. And Prim used it to collect, especially to collect songs. He had a man in Gary Ricken, John Dunn, a teacher there, who collected songs in Irish and possibly English as well, and another man called James Brennan. And these, the Irish ones, were published some years ago by Daithí O'Hogan in 2 volumes. One was Dúnar a Osriach for the ones connected with Kilkenny, and Dúnar a Hibredorn for the ones connected with Tipperary. At the same time, Graves paid this man, James Fogarty from Tibberaghny, for reports on the traditions and antiquities of the Barony of Iverk. Now, the original manuscript was sold at the auction of James Graves' library after he died in 1885, and we don't know where it is now, if it still exists. But luckily, a copy had been made of it, and it's in the Department of Folklore in UCD. There are some references to Fogerty in the early, probably the first volume of the Kilkenny Archaeological Society. Graves used some of his material on traditions of the Fianna and material like that. And also there's a count of some antiquities, small objects that were found and were donated to the museum at the time. They should be in the National Museum these days. So, who was James Fogarty? This is a copy of his self-portrait in the original manuscript. He was born, according to himself, about 1815. There's virtually nothing known about him apart from what's in this manuscript. Even his family is quite hard to trace, in that they're not in the Tithe Plotman books, probably because they weren't farmers, I think. They're not in Griffith's valuation because they were gone at that stage. There was none of them left in Tibbroughney. I have a suspicion that his father might have been a teacher, and that might explain his good education. I've been able to tie down who might have been his father and mother in baptismal records in the Catholic parish there, and it seems to be John Fogerty and Cathy Dullan. And a Biddy, a daughter, was born in 1805, and a James in 1809. Now that's a little bit early for our James, about 6 years too early. But I think this is the family, but that is not the James. And what happened those days, quite a lot, if a child died quite young, the next boy that was born could get the same name. It happened in my own family even. So there is a gap in the baptismal records between June and September 1815, and I think that must be when he was born. How did Fogerty get in touch with James Graves? I think it was through a man called W.R. Blackett, who lived at Piltown, probably in Beline House. I think he might have been the agent of the Earl of Bessborough, and he was a member of the Kilkenny Archaeological Society right from the start, and corresponding member for the Piltown area. So I think it must have been him that put Fogerty in touch with Graves. Now, they never met face to face. It was all done by letters. And Graves paid him 5 shillings for each report and some extra money if paper and other things were necessary, postage, etc. And it all went through the post office in Piltown. And he said at some stage that John Anthony of the post office was the only one who knew what he was getting paid. Must have come as a postal order. So he was in quite poor circumstances at this stage. At one stage he must have said to Graves that his clothes were deteriorating, and Graves somehow sent him a big overcoat, and he was very happy with that. Then he recorded in 1851 that the last bit of roof of the old family house was pulled down, so I don't know where he was living. He might have been with a sister or something at that stage. And that also his dearest cousin and comrade emigrated in 1851 also. Graves gave him a reference for a job at one stage, and I quote here, "I met Mr. Fletcher at the railway works," that was the railway coming down to Waterford at the time, "and handed him your excellent recommendation. He read it attentively and told me there was no vacancy for me at present until they take a further extent of works. He returned me your letter and told me to bring it to him another time." He was unfortunately unlucky with that. Now, the copy of the manuscript that exists was copied by the daughters of Maurice Lenihan. Maurice Lenihan is the famous historian of Limerick. He produced a fantastic volume on the history of the city of Limerick. And he borrowed the copy from James Graves around 1871, and he got his daughters to copy it. It's in the folklore department in UCD now. There's a letter from Graves, you can see it here on the right, pasted into it, and it says, "My dear sir," and it's headed the Royal Historical and Archaeological Association of Ireland. That's what the title of the society had become at that stage. Ennisnag, Stonyford. "My dear sir, in consequence of the quarter day falling on a holy day, Wednesday the 1st, we have been obliged to put off the meeting of the 15th, 3rd Wednesday, so don't come to us before that day. There has been most provoking and indefensible delay in Gill's office," they were the people who were publishing it at the time, "about the April part of the journal, with your shield paper." And this was a paper on a Bronze Age shield from Lochgore. "It will soon be out, I hope. When you can do so, send me the Fogerty manuscript. I want it very much. Yours, J. Graves." So the manuscript, there are problems with it. There are places where Maurice Lenihan's daughters couldn't make out the writing. There are sort of little gaps in it. There's Irish script, or was Irish script, in the original manuscript. And unfortunately, they were not used to Irish script, so it's nearly gobbledygook that nobody can make anything much of it. It's hard to know. The drawings look a little bit amateurish. Maybe they were better in the original manuscript. We don't know. So it has its faults. Graves also put James Fogarty in touch with Sir William Wilde, who was the father of Oscar Wilde and was a great archaeologist, etc., and George Petrie, again, wonderful archaeologist and artist and musician and everything. So, just to quote again, he says in regard to to Wilde, "I am writing and collecting for Dr. Wilde still, but it is a subject that dares not give me much spirit." This was folklore in particular. "The people would look on these researches rather suspicious, yet I think it laudable to recover and preserve all remains of the good old times, not in the least fearing that I will entail any disgrace to our poor country or its declining old stock. I have sent 5 or 6 communications to Dr. Wilde as well as I could. He considered them not only interesting, but exceedingly valuable, and has transmitted money twice since I began for him, 10 shillings each turn." So. And Wilde's book, he published a book called Irish Popular Superstitions. He doesn't mention Fogarty's name, but he gives an account of May Day around the moat or mott at Tibbroughney, and that must have come from Fogerty. So in connection with Petrie, it was music that he sent him. So he must have had the knowledge of musical notation, writing it out, because again, he wouldn't have met either of these people. He says at one stage in the manuscript that he was a self-taught flute player, and he must have had quite a few airs, because in Petrie's book of Ancient Irish Music, he has 14 airs that he attributes to James Fogarty. And he wrote, "This march tune, together with many other airs of great beauty, which will be given in the course of this work, was sent to me by Mr. James Fogarty, a farmer," I don't think he's correct in that, "of more than ordinary cultivation of mind, who previously to the spring of 1852 had resided in the parish of Tibberaghny, County Kilkenny, but from the depression of the times was then compelled to emigrate to America." So that was published in 1855, just a few years later. So the geographical area of the book, or of the manuscript, is very much in Tibbroughney. He also makes a foray across the river at some stage. He hailed a fisherman to ferry him across. Of course, there was no bridge in Fadown in those days. And he went into Tibberaghny as far as Kilcash, which I'll mention later also. So this was his home territory here. Here's Tibbroughney, the church and the castle. And something that will come up later is the draining of the slabland here of Tibbroughney. I suppose this bit here especially. And I'll be mentioning that in a little while. Also, places they're not as clear on that map as on the other one. So, moving on. This part of County Kilkenny was a very cultured area back in the early 19th century. Brewer, in his Beauties of Ireland, lists the paintings that were in Bessborough House, and it was quite extraordinary. Rembrandts and all sorts of things like that. Really amazing. Then in Beline House here, the agent of the Earl of Bessborough was a man called Peter Walsh, and he died in 1819. He encouraged young men locally to train as artists, and he used one of his pavilions, you can see them here each side of the house, as a sort of artists' academy. And that might have fed in also to James Fogarty's knowledge of art and sketching, etc. Then Redmond Anthony, who died in 1848, was the postmaster and proprietor of the hotel here in Piltown. And he had a museum in this building. It was in the upper part of the house there. This was the post office here underneath. He charged people to visit the museum, and he donated all the money he collected to a hospital in Carrick. The book that lists all the people who visited survives, and Mary Cahill who used to be in the National Museum, is working on it at the moment, and it could be an interesting paper in due course. Redmond Anthony had a great collection of antiquities and of gold, in particular prehistoric gold, in this museum. And he also had a fine collection of pictures, again, some well-known ones again. And he's an interesting character. He was from a Catholic family, and his wife was a sister of Kelly the boy from Killarn. You heard from 1798, which is an unusual little piece of information that Mary Cahill gave me. This part of the country, again, was famous for Irish scholarship. Just over to the east a bit, it produced people like John O'Donovan and the Annals of the Four Masters, etc., the editor of it. James Scurry, also a famous Irish scholar. And then very close to Piltown in Owning, a man called Patrick O'Neill, who was a miller. And he died in 1832. He was a great Irish scholar and a great musician as well. And Fogerty mentions him a few times and mentions his widow and how he was getting some information from her still. And some of his manuscripts survive to this day in different collections. So you can see some of the influences that may have been going to the making of James Fogarty. So Tibberaghny then is an interesting place in itself. It's the name is, there's about 10 different ways of spelling it, but in Irish it's Tibberaghny, which is the well of presumably Saint Fochna, but Saint Fochna isn't the patron saint of the place, it's a Saint Morgan Og, so it is a bit strange in that way. It has a very old church. The chancel of it is a pre-Romanesque church with ante, and there's a carved pillar stone there, which could be the shaft of a cross, and you can see some of the sculpture on it here, and there are sort of strange creatures, a centaur, etc. on it. There was a motte in Tibberaghny. It was over here. This is it here. Unfortunately, it was levelled in the 1960s. And it was built by John, King John. Well, he was only Lord of Ireland at the time in 1185 when he came over. And Fogerty mentions also the site of a town. And if you look at the whole arrangement of fields here, they're very well laid out on each side. So there could have been a sort of rural borough or whatever here beside the motte, the church, and the tower house then is just there. So some traditions that Fogerty records about Tibberaghny, he mentions a Captain Huggett, who I think might be a Captain Robert Huggard, who was in the Duke of Ormond's regiment in the Restoration period from 1660s on. It says here, Captain Huggett lived a while in the castle. He spent 3 firkins of gold in making banks to the shore, but one stormy night a high tide came, overflowed and broke the bank. He then left the castle with disgust and grief for his money, and putting his remaining gold in 2 boots, placed them before him on his saddle, took his horse and rode towards Kilkenny or Dublin. When at the Countess's Bush, that'll come up later as well, he looked back at the shore and saw the great overflow of water on the flats of Tibberaghny. He knelt down and gave the castle his malediction. His ghost is said to haunt the castle still, and a closed entrance is called Captain Huggett's Hole. So that's Captain Huggett. Later again then the Briscoes got possession of Tibberaghny. According to Fogerty, one of the Briscoes got it from Lady Iva of Kilcash by pretending to be a Catholic. They did this by the following stratagem, suggested by a silenced priest who was a great companion of one of them. Briscoe often went for possession to Kilcash when he used to lodge for a night, usually, where he used to lodge. but would not get it on account of the distrust the lady entertained of his religion. According to the advice of the priest, he left his beads after him in the bed, and on the servant making it known to the lady, she sent for him shortly after to come to Kilcash and gave him possession of Tibbroughney. Then going on, the last Briscoe who resided here in 1740 sent one of his sons to learn the rope manufacture, etc., and planted hemp in all the flats and bogs. That excellent young man, being just come home to Tibbroughney by Waterford, saw a young man, a widow's son, drowning in the shore, and none to save him. He jumped in the raging flood and endeavoured to save him, was carried under by the drowning man to rise no more alive. This being made known to the father, who was unable to support his grief, set fire to some thousands of pounds worth of hemp in ricks at the castle, which was to set up the son who had a contract of supplying part of the English navy with ropes, sailcloth, etc. This was the last of the three Henrys Briscoe, I presume, who are mentioned in the Keen of Aileen Nora Gall. Sounds like an Irish poem. It isn't in the manuscript anyhow. So, and it's interesting that in 1635, Sir William Brereton, who was a traveller to Ireland, came to Tibbroughney and made the point that the marshland should be drained and that it would be valuable. So maybe this Captain Huggard took up his advice. But I'm only guessing. I haven't got a historical record that he was definitely there. The castle, of course, is a fine tower house. You can see it here. This is the door of it. In the past, it was thought that this was the castle that was built by King John, but in fact, it's a 15th or early 16th century tower house, and the castle built by King John was the motte. So Fogerty has some interesting information on megalithic tombs in the area. You can see here, this is Ballyhennebury Portal Tomb, and in the Miller-Robertson collection, there is a lovely drawing of it in the Royal Society of Antiquaries in Dublin from about 1810. You can see it here. It still survives today. And here are some of Fogarty's drawings of it. But what he does draw is a sort of a strange curve, rectangular curve around it. And this would be a very rare feature. It doesn't exist anymore, but I'm sure it could be found in archaeological excavation at the site or some trace of it. So that's some interesting information. Also, the monument at Tubrad, another portal tomb, again drawn by Miller here at the bottom in 1810 and later made into a print in honour of John G.A. Prynne. This is Fogarty's drawing of it, or the copy of his drawing, and he reports that in the meantime an attempt was made to blow up this monument and that there were holes drilled into it and some of the large stones cracked up. It's still in more or less that condition, and for some reason it's not marked on any map. It wasn't in any list of portal tombs, though it was known of way back, but it's still there. And Paul Walsh, who worked with the Megalithic survey, he went there and sort of rediscovered it, really. I also told him some years ago about this monument at Rathcorby, another megalithic tomb, and it's completely unknown and only known from Fogarty's manuscript. And Paul Walsh found it and has recorded it now. The other image here is of what I presume is a piece of rock art with all these concentric circles on it, and it's he said was found near this large enclosure in a place called Rathclarish in County Tipperary, not far from the Kilkenny border. Again, there isn't any other rock art in that immediate area. There's Knockrow, which has Passage Tomb art, all right, close enough. And the enclosure is very interesting too, and it had a stream running out of it. And here it is marked on the 25-inch map, a very good plan of it, and an important plan because, again, this has been demolished, probably in the 1970s, bulldozed, unfortunately. And there's a lot of springs around that area, so I'd say it was an important sort of ritual area in prehistoric times. So, moving on then, there was a column from the cloister at Jerpoint brought down to Fidown. I think Carrigan mentions that it was at Fidown Church or graveyard back in 1905 or so. And I'm sure it was Peter Walsh who brought it down because it has a Walsh knight on it. And in Sheffield Grace's memoir, The Grace Family, there was a print of it. You can see it here. This is Fogerty's drawing of it. And there was a knight on each side. So this is the Walsh knight here with these little arrows on it and the chevron. The other has a chevron with ermine or something behind. We don't know who exactly. It might be the Holden family, I'm not sure. It survives in a very damaged way, but with the heads gone and the feet gone, in Carrick Museum. And you can see pictures of it here, and you can see what the Butler Knight at Jerpoint looks like here. Very similar in every way. So this is quite a unique drawing in the long run, showing both. And you can see too, from looking at that in fact it's more accurate than these little arrows there on the print. So next I come to Kilcash, and I have to admit to being biased in this is because my father came from Kilcash and his family go back there for some time. And only recently there was a fine book produced on Kilcash by John Flood, a local man there. And in his research he found a drawing of Kilcash that was never known before. It was misfiled in the Royal Irish Academy under a townland called Kilcash that has nothing in it, in Roscommon, when all the time it was Kilcash and Tipperary. This is the drawing. And it's by George Victor Dunoyer, who worked with the Ordnance Survey and was a wonderful artist. It's very faint now because it's a pencil drawing. But it shows the house at Kilcash, which was about 10 bays long. You only have this little bit surviving today. And this is from 1840. And Fogerty draws it then in 1851, only about 10 years later. And a huge amount of it has been demolished in the meantime. We've no record of this happening. I wonder, was it famine relief works or something like that? Fogerty, by the way, just never even mentioned the famine. And it's only a short few years afterwards that he's writing. So this is interesting in pinning down when this very fine house was demolished. Of course, around 1800, the roof was taken off it, and that's the time when the Lament of Kilcash was written, Paddy Enemy, Fasta Gunaiman, etc. And then this is the church at Kilcash, and the chancel of it is again an early church, pre-Romanesque. And you can see he shows it with very large stones, which is correct. And this is a Romanesque doorway here going into the nave, which was added to the earlier church. So the next picture there is just of Granny Castle, and a famous person connected with it is Margaret Fitzgerald, Maura or Greg or something, I can never pronounce that one, Ní Garrod. And she's quite well known down here in folklore, known as the Countess or the Countess of Granny. In this part of the country too, in part of Kilkenny, some of especially the Walshes and the Daltons, were more inclined to support the Earl of Desmond than the Earl of Ormond, particularly. And the Countess down there was seen as an evil and a cruel person. And Sceach, a place called Sceach, just at Kilcash there on the way down to Carrick, was known as the Countess's Bush, or Sceach na Countessa, something like that, and it's mentioned like that quite a lot, and she's supposed to have hanged a man from that hawthorn tree at some stage. So there's a most unusual story told, right here now, about the Countess and Granny Castle. And I quote it here: "She gave a grand entertainment in the castle of Granny. All the nobles of Leinster and Munster were invited, and the chief of the Brannocks or Walshes, Peerish, attended there, and after all the entertainments and feasting were ended, the guests all went home except Peerish Walsh, who was privately conveyed into the great prison tower, where he lived for 7 years, and the Countess gave him only to eat of salt meat and oaten bread. There used to be a drop of water falling through the arched roof of his prison, and he used to supply his thirst by lying on his back and receiving the falling drop when unable to stand. His neck was stiff and his face turned upwards from trying to catch it while standing before this. There was a nurse in the castle who used to go visit his gate or cell out of curiosity. No other person used to be allowed, except by order and under inspection of the Countess. Yet the Countess used experience her, lest she might bring him any food or drink to allay his thirst and torture. The nurse used to give him her breast to suckle through the bars, until at last the Countess detected her and had her immediately put to death." So this is the most extraordinary motif in literature called Caritas Romana. You can look it up on Wikipedia or Google, and it goes back to ancient Greece and Roman literature, and then it was presented as a Christian virtue. A daughter sustaining her father, or even sometimes the mother, in this way when they were in jail and deprived of sustenance. And in one, even there's the Wittenberg Illustrated Catechism has it. You can see it here on the right, from 1558. And it's also depicted by a lot of well-known artists, Rembrandt, Caravaggio, etc. This one here is by Gaspar de Creyer in 1645. But it's, as far as I can make out, it's pretty much a unique version of this story in modern Irish folklore. So is particularly interesting in that way. It's also known of in modern folklore in Spain, Portugal and Greece, and it's known in different art forms in Scandinavia, even in churches there. So it's very rare as far as I can make out. So yeah, these pictures are just put up for a bit of colour. They're nothing to do with the manuscript. But I just want to quote a bit about the Newmarket affray, which, you know, Newmarket in South Kilkenny, there was a white boy incident there, something like the Battle of Carrickshock, but it was much earlier. It's in the 1760s. So Fogerty, when describing the ruined church at Ullard, I went down to Ullard today to have a look at it. I couldn't find his grave, or the grave of this man. He gave an extended account of the Newmarket affray in 1764 in relation to the headstone of Edmund Tobin, who was executed for his part in it. He said, "The gravestone of Edmund Tobin is an interesting memorial of this locality and over the neighbouring counties. His name is still venerated. At Michaelmas 1763, 4 or 5 of the neighbouring young men including Tobin's brother, were taken and conveyed to Kilkenny jail under military escort under a white boy charge. Edmund Tobin was conspicuous as one of the chief leaders who got a mock funeral ready, pursued the army, and overtook them at Newmarket, Ballyribeen. After the rescue of the prisoners and the deaths of several of the army and country people, the fight was lost in consequence of sparing the life of some soldiers who called for a priest, but on getting free, rallied, reloaded their guns, and concealed in a garden made the people retreat after great slaughter. Edmund Tobin was taken into Kilkenny jail, kept in prison 6 months. Any means were used to make him discover on his accomplices. Pardon and gold were offered if he would give down one name. His wife, Hannah Scales, and 2 children, the eldest was 3 years old, were employed by the government to prevail on him and get him his pardon, etc. But it was all to no use. He was hanged and instantly beheaded. His family got his body, and his sister, a young woman who bid him against the lamenting appeals of his wife to die a noble death, took his head in her apron, clasped it to her breast, and sewed it to the body, and had it waked 3 nights and 3 days in Ullid. The father, who died for Newmarket, and son are thus mentioned on a small plain stone on the west side of the Ullid churchyard. I couldn't find it today. Edmund Tobin departed this life, this is what's on the headstone according to Fogerty, April 22nd in the year of 1764, aged 31 years. Also his son Edmund Tobin departed this life August 13, 1790, aged 29 years. And he says then that the Newmarket incident was or is a principal point of tradition of the people of the barony, etc., to count ages, etc., as later from 1798. So it was very famous around there. He also talks of faction fighting, and he says the last battle fought by these, the O'Sheas and the Holdens, were the 2 families down that area that got involved in factions. The last battle was at the races of Bessborough in 1826 and was gained by the Holdens. More than 200 men were engaged, all with sticks and 2-handled wattles. More than 50 men were disabled or died in that conflict in the course of a year. The gentry, police and military were unable to separate them. So that gives an idea of these faction fights at the time. He also gives accounts of May Eve at Tibberaghny Moat, which you can see up here, and as I said, no longer exists. And then he says the dancers spent the night at Nagel's old assembly rooms, now Mr. Anthony's. A case of misconduct or quarrelling is not recorded. This used to be generally on Old May Day, the 11th of May now. Fogerty then describes a bonfire on the 23rd of June. These would be lit on all the hills in each side of the river shore. He recorded the greatest of them was at Garrynorray on the 24th. And then, I quote, "I recollect to see it a great bonfire, 1824 and later. Several horseloads of gross timber and butts of oak drawn by men and boys, besides loads of furs for kindling. The several hunters dead in the country were carried to the noble Jack of Harriers at Garrynorray, dray horses, used to crown the pile or pyramid with trophies of their bleached bare white limbs, skulls, etc." Gives a meaning to bonfire. Yeah. He also described divination practices on 1st of November and how on St. Martin's Day, the 11th of November, how it was marked. And I quote, "Every mill, a few excepted, is stopped before 12 o'clock the previous night in these localities. Grain, woolen and linen, which are not worked on this day, or any machinery turned by wheels, etc., and very few ploughs worked or cars drawn by horses. It was all connected with the tradition that a wheel was used for the death of Saint Martin. So finally, poor James Fogarty had to emigrate across the water, and we have the last two letters from him also, and the penultimate one is headed Waterford, 24th of April 1852. Reverend Sir, I have received your two notes which came to hand through Mr. J. Anthony and Co. I wish I could express my gratitude. We are just drawing out of the channel. If I got Dr. Petrie's proposal in time, I would accept of it instantly. If I were to struggle for 3 months in Tibberaghny, the die is cast. I have not home to return to except the churchyard, home of the extinct Fogertys. If the Almighty preserves my life and favours me, I will do my utmost to come back by Dublin in years 2 or 3, I hope. Yours sincerely and affectionately, James Fogarty. Excuse haste. On board the ship called Lawrence Forrestal. And it's addressed to Reverend James Graves, King Street, Kilkenny, at that stage. So the final letter then, it's a longer one, and it's sent from Newfoundland. And so it's at Harbour Grace, Conception Bay, Newfoundland, November 15th, 1853. Dear and Reverend Sir, it is time I should let you know something of my situation in this country, which I would have done much sooner if there was any pleasing prospect offering to me that I might gratefully and joyfully lay before you who took such anxious interest in my welfare at home. It is with pain I must mention, and to you above all my friends on earth, that my life has been nothing enviable. I was encouraged to come here by friends whom I supposed had interest among the merchants to procure me some little office that would support me, but I was woefully disappointed. There are 2 merchants here who monopolise all the trade of the bay. This was in Newfoundland, around St. John's, etc. They never employ any Irishmen except tradesmen and labourers. After I came here, June 3rd, 1852, I remained idle 6 months by the advice of my friends, expecting to get some appropriate situation. There was a young clergyman, a fellow passenger from Ireland, took compassion on my disappointed state and offered me a situation as schoolmaster in a remote out harbour. I declined, not supposing myself capable of fulfilling that office. I got employment in the principal factory of St. John's, the establishment of the Honorary C.F. Bennett Sawmills, Foundry and Distillery. I had made myself capable of doing business in several tasks, as well as those employed there for years before. I used to be called on to assist the clerks in filling accounts and making payments every Saturday. My friends in Harbour Grace sent for me again last spring to fill my situation of tide waiter as custom house officer, which I still enjoy, but the pay arriving here from all the foreign shipping entering here is small enough to support one officer having no standing salary attached, only whilst the vessels are discharging, £4 sterling per day, which would not average 8 per week throughout the year. I was just taking my passage home to you by Liverpool in a vessel going in a few days, but have now made up my mind to remain until after next spring, in order to acquaint your reverence and have your clerical advice on the matter, to try once more the sacred and beloved land of my birth. If you can find me employment in any department, railway station, etc., or if that great and generous Irishman of the bright heart and soul, Dr. Petrie, can find me any station connected with the dear old country music, and you may rely on my word that he and you won't regret having me among you. Alas, this is a wretched country in appearance, leaving the bright port of Waterford into the perpetual fog of Newfoundland banks, catching glimpses of the... I'll get the next picture here. of the stony, rocky and narrow mouth of the harbour reminded me of the fall of Lucifer and Adam. This is St. John's. Yeah.
No picture.
Sorry, it didn't go. Oh no, I hit the wrong. Yeah, sorry, thanks. Reminded me of the fall of Lucifer and Adam. I think it looks lovely. I was over there a few years ago. At first, the apparent liberty of the country interested me, but in my succeeding studies, I find it not worth a thought, except to those who can realise a fortune by barefaced policy or wring it by extortion from the poor, dependent Irishmen. If nothing offers me a chance of going home and being able to live amongst you, I will try my fortune on the American continent, the grave, the untimely one of thousands of my countrymen. I am tiring you, Reverend dear Sir. I could wish to write for months, but trust in God and you that I will have personal conversation before I die in my native land. I am adding to my notes of antiquity daily at leisure times. God be with you. Yours most sincerely, respectfully and affectionately, James Fogarty. So it was sort of headed, Reverend James Graves. I enclose this in a letter to Mr. Hugh Coulahan of Piltown, a worthy man and lover of his country's antiquities, etc. So I was in touch with John Mannion, who is a great scholar in St. John's in Newfoundland, to see if he could find out anything that happened to James Fogarty afterwards. And he did find his death notice in a local paper, the Newfoundlander of the 3rd of April 1865. And it reads, James Fogarty, 1813-1865, of Piltown, County Kilkenny, died at Turk's Gut near Brigus, Conception Bay, aged 52. So I hope I have brought James Fogarty back to notice after having been forgotten for so long. I have an article coming out in the next Journal of the Royal Society of Antiquaries on him, which contains more information than I could use in this talk tonight. So finally, I'd like to thank especially Christopher McCartig of the Folklore Department in UCD for his assistance, and would like to thank you all for your attention. Thank you very much.